You just bought an Aston Martin V8 Vantage. The dealer hands you the key. The Aston Martin key is leather-wrapped, premium-feeling, sophisticated. The Aston Martin key looks exactly like what you'd expect from a luxury British sports car. But take a knife and scrape the leather off the back of that Aston Martin key fob. Under the leather, molded into the plastic, is the Volvo logo. Your Aston Martin key is a Volvo key with expensive leather glued over it. The Ford ownership era. Let's go back to the late 1990s and early 2000s. Ford was building an automotive empire. Ford bought Jaguar in 1989. Ford acquired Aston Martin in 1994. Ford purchased Volvo's car division in 1999. Ford owned Land Rover. Ford controlled multiple luxury and premium brands under the Premier Automotive Group. The strategy behind Ford's Premier Automotive Group was platform sharing. Ford would develop common platforms, components, and systems that multiple brands could use. Ford could spread development costs across Jaguar, Aston Martin, Volvo, and Land Rover. Ford would achieve economies of scale while each brand maintained its distinct identity and character. But platform sharing created problems. How do you make a Volvo, a Swedish, safety-focused family car brand, share components with Aston Martin, a British luxury sports car maker? How do you maintain brand prestige when customers discover their expensive Aston Martin uses Volvo parts? Ford needed to hide the parts sharing carefully. The Aston Martin V8 Vantage launched in 2005. The V8 Vantage was Aston Martin's entry-level sports car, though entry-level meant it still cost over $100,000. The V8 Vantage was gorgeous, with classic Aston Martin styling and a thunderous V8. The V8 Vantage attracted buyers who wanted Aston Martin heritage and performance. But the Aston Martin V8 Vantage key shared significant components with Ford products. The V8 Vantage used Ford switchgear in the interior. The V8 Vantage borrowed electronic components from Ford parts bins. And the Aston Martin V8 Vantage key? The V8 Vantage key was directly from Volvo's parts catalog. Ford decided that developing a unique Aston Martin key system was unnecessary when Volvo already had perfectly functional key fobs. The key fob disguise. The Volvo key fob Ford chose for the Aston Martin V8 Vantage was functional and reliable. Volvo key fobs were well engineered with good range and solid electronics. The Volvo key worked perfectly for keyless entry and engine starting. But the Volvo key looked like a Volvo key. The Volvo key fob had the distinctive Volvo design and prominent Volvo logo molded into the plastic. Aston Martin couldn't hand customers a Volvo key fob. Aston Martin buyers paying six figures for a luxury British sports car would be outraged receiving a Swedish family car key. The Aston Martin brand image required that every touchpoint feel exclusive, premium, and distinctly Aston Martin. The V8 Vantage key needed to look like it belonged to an Aston Martin. So Aston Martin wrapped the Volvo key. The Aston Martin leather cover that completely hid the Volvo logo underneath. The Aston Martin leather cover was high quality, stitched carefully and finished beautifully. The Aston Martin key felt premium in your hand. The leather-wrapped Aston Martin key looked appropriate for a luxury sports car. The Aston Martin key disguise was effective. Most V8 Vantage owners never discovered their Aston Martin key was actually a Volvo key. The leather wrapping completely concealed the Volvo logo and design. The Aston Martin key felt special enough that owners didn't question its origins. The disguise worked perfectly for maintaining the Aston Martin premium image. But curious owners eventually discovered the truth. Some Aston Martin V8 Vantage owners needed key repairs or replacements. Some owners accidentally damaged their Aston Martin leather cover. When the leather came off, owners found the Volvo logo staring back at them. The Aston Martin key secret was exposed. The luxury British sports car key was Swedish underneath. The discovery spread through Aston Martin owner forums and enthusiast communities. Aston Martin V8 Vantage owners shared photos of the Volvo logo hidden under leather. The Aston Martin key revelation became automotive folklore. The story represented everything controversial about Ford's ownership era. cost-cutting through part sharing that undermined brand prestige.
The price gouge. Here's where the Aston Martin key story becomes truly outrageous. The replacement cost. Lose your Aston Martin V8 Vantage key and the Aston Martin dealer quotes you around $1,500 for a replacement. The Aston Martin key replacement includes programming and the leather-wrapped fob. $1,500 for a key. That's expensive even by luxury car standards. But remember, the Aston Martin key is just a leather-wrapped Volvo key. A Volvo key fob costs around $200 from a Volvo dealer. The Volvo key is the exact same electronic component that's inside the Aston Martin leather wrapping. The actual functional part, the Volvo key, costs $200. The Aston Martin markup is purely for the leather wrapping and the Aston Martin badge. Smart Aston Martin V8 Vantage owners discovered a workaround. Buy a Volvo key fob for $200. Program the Volvo key to your Aston Martin V8 Vantage. The programming is identical because it's the same system. Either use the Volvo key as is or buy aftermarket leather wrapping if you want to maintain the Aston Martin aesthetic. Total cost, maybe $300. The Aston Martin dealer charges $1,500 for the exact same result. The Aston Martin key markup is 750%. The Aston Martin key costs 7.5 times more than the identical Volvo key underneath. This markup exists purely because of the Aston Martin brand. The leather wrapping costs maybe $50 to produce. The Aston Martin key programming is the same as Volvo. The $1,300 difference between the Volvo key and Aston Martin key is pure profit from brand positioning. This price gouging extends throughout Aston Martin parts pricing. Aston Martin owners pay enormous markups for components that are shared with Ford products. The Aston Martin ownership experience includes discovering that expensive replacement parts are actually cheap Ford or Volvo components with luxury pricing. The Aston Martin key is just the most visible and absurd example. The Aston Martin key story reveals the uncomfortable economics of luxury car ownership. Aston Martin buyers pay premium prices expecting exclusive components. The Aston Martin brand promises British craftsmanship and heritage, but the Aston Martin V8 Vantage reality included significant part sharing with mass-market Ford products. The Aston Martin key epitomizes this contradiction. Swedish practicality disguised as British luxury. Ford's ownership of Aston Martin had benefits. Ford money saved Aston Martin from bankruptcy. Ford money funded the V8 Vantage and DB9 development. Ford resources helped Aston Martin survive and eventually thrive. But Ford part sharing damaged Aston Martin's premium image. The Aston Martin key wasn't the only shared component. Aston Martin interiors had Ford switches, Ford electronics, and Ford platform components throughout. Modern Aston Martin, now independent from Ford, is eliminated most part sharing. Current Aston Martin models use Mercedes-AMG engines but develop unique chassis and bodies. Modern Aston Martin keys are genuinely Aston Martin designs, not borrowed from other manufacturers. The Volvo key era is over. But the Aston Martin V8 Vantage from the Ford era remains a reminder of that controversial period. The Volvo key doesn't make the Aston Martin V8 Vantage a bad car. The V8 Vantage is beautiful, sounds incredible, and drives wonderfully. The V8 Vantage is a genuine Aston Martin in the ways that matter: styling, character, and driving experience. The Volvo key is a minor component that doesn't affect how the V8 Vantage performs, but the Volvo key symbolizes the compromises Ford made during its Aston Martin ownership. Aston Martin collectors now view Ford-era models differently. The V8 Vantage and DB9 are appreciated for their design and performance, but acknowledged for their part-sharing reality. The Volvo key story is part of Ford-era Aston Martin folklore. These cars are less pure Aston Martin than earlier or later models, but they're also more affordable and easier to maintain because of part sharing. The Aston Martin key pricing remains controversial. Even knowing the Aston Martin key is just a Volvo key underneath, dealers still charge $1,500 for replacements. The Aston Martin markup persists because most owners don't know about the Volvo connection or don't want to use a Volvo-branded key in their Aston Martin. The luxury tax continues, even when the luxury is just leather wrapped around ordinary components. This is the $200 Aston Martin key. The Aston Martin V8 Vantage key looks premium with its leather wrapping and sophisticated feel, but scrape off that leather and you'll find a Volvo logo molded into the plastic. The Aston Martin key is a $200 Volvo key fob wrapped in expensive leather and sold for $1,500. The Aston Martin key story represents Ford-era part sharing at its most visible. The Aston Martin V8 Vantage borrowed components from Volvo and Ford while maintaining British sports car character. The Volvo key worked perfectly, but Aston Martin needed to hide it behind leather to preserve brand image. Your Aston Martin key is Swedish underneath the British luxury exterior, and that's the reality of luxury car economics during Ford's Premier Automotive period.